Welcome everyone to our first statewide staff meeting for 2023. I would like to start the meeting with an acknowledgement of country. We recognise the ongoing custodians of the lands and waterways where we work and live. We pay respect to elders past and present as ongoing teachers of knowledge, songlines and stories. We strive to ensure every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learner in New South Wales achieves their potential through education. I am joining you today from the land of the Darawal people. Darawal is said to be the language spoken by the mobs that had a relationship with the area south of Botany Bay and Georges River, west to Appin, down as far as Goulburn and to Wreck Bay near Nowra. The elders are advocates and cultural historians for this rich and inspiring culture that has thrived for over 8,500 years in this area. Research and study of many hours of spoken language has helped it to be revived. Aboriginal people lived in bands that primarily moved about within their own language group's territory. Their theory was, why write something down when you can talk directly to a person? As many of you may be joining us for the first time, and because we have a new team member, I would like to introduce our team to you. Elizabeth Robertson, as you probably all know, is the coordinator of Languages and Culture, and I am the Languages Advisor. You all know Corina Allen, Chanel Ingram, and Victoria Hay, our language officers. This year, Kristen Faraday has joined our team from Victory High School in Wollongong as Relieving Language Officer. Also, Renetta Wolf is continuing as our Curriculum Implementation Officer. And further, we have Mieko Shida and Taka Yoshino in our team, who are located at the Tonkin Centre. As you know, at the end of last year, NESA published 3 new languages syllabuses. These are the Modern Languages K-10 syllabus, the Classical Languages K-10 syllabus, and the Aboriginal Languages K-10 syllabus. NESA's curriculum reform timeline clearly indicates that 2023 is a plan and prepare year before the new syllabuses are taught in schools from 2024. The syllabuses are available on the New South Wales curriculum website. A 4th languages syllabus will be published this year, and it will be for Auslan K-10. The Languages and Culture team is planning the following support for 2023 and 2024. For the new modern and classical languages syllabuses, we will create the following resources. Scope and sequences for stage 4 for 100 hours and stage 5 for 200 hours. Unit of work with accompanying assessment tasks, related resources, and 3 microlearning modules. For classical languages, for Latin, we're going to create scope and sequences, 100 hours for stage 4 and 200 hours for stage 5. Units of work with accompanying assessment tasks, and 1 microlearning module. Our ability to provide this support relies on working with practicing classroom teachers. So if you see EOIs for writing teams, that's what they relate to. In addition to our support for the new syllabuses, we're offering the following PL in 2023. Statewide staff meetings, which happen in week 4 every term. Face-to-face PL via our networks, language-specific conferences, languages and literacy PL, which is now accredited, 2 microlearning modules on stage 6 beginners and continuous speaking skills, and 2 new e-courses, which will soon be accredited. The first one, it's student motivation and engagement in languages, and the other one, high potential and gifted students in languages 7 to 10. We will publish a full list of dates in our statewide staff room soon, so you can add them to your diaries. So how is the new Modern Languages K-10 syllabus different? There are many things about the new syllabus that are very similar to the ones we're currently using, which means we don't need to start from scratch when we program, but we do need to refine our teaching, learning, and assessment activities to align with the new outcomes and content. And having explored the new syllabus in detail, our team is genuinely excited about the changes. We summarised everything in this infographic in our statewide staff room, which you have probably seen. Let's break them down a little. There is one syllabus for all modern languages. The same outcomes and content will make collaborative planning easier for teachers. There is a stronger focus on students and their world. The central goal is communicating in the target language, exposing students to as much of the target language as possible and encouraging them to use it as a medium in the classroom as they progress. Culture cannot be taught in isolation from the language. The syllabus emphasises using and understanding culturally appropriate target language. There are just 3 outcomes per stage instead of 8 or 9 that we're currently working with: interacting, understanding texts, and creating texts. Students apply knowledge of language systems and develop intercultural capability through all the outcomes. For all stages, interacting is primarily done through oral language and extends to socializing in stages 4 and 5. It's about spontaneous exchanges, so we need to provide our students with as much comprehensible target language input and scaffolds to help them build towards that spontaneity. There are 3 proficiency levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced, with examples for each. It's more supportive of students with disability. It includes teaching advice linked to each outcome and stage. Language skills and literacy are more explicit in the content. Outcomes and content for stage 5 allow for clearer progression into stage 6. Teachers make decisions about the sequence and emphasis given to content based on the needs of their students. It's also a digital syllabus, allowing you to choose what you want on the screen or what you want to print for ease of programming. To find out how to access and use the digital syllabus, you can view our how-to video. The link is in our statewide staff room and on YouTube for those who don't have access to the staff room. The diagram on the screen shows how the Modern Languages K-10 syllabus is organised. As you can see, the central goal is communication in the target language. This is shown in the red line. The syllabus has 3 focus areas: interacting, understanding texts, and creating texts. Each focus area has its own related outcomes for each stage. There are only 3 outcomes per stage instead of 8 or 9. Applying knowledge of language systems and developing intercultural capability span all 3 focus areas. This means that students are expected to use and understand culturally appropriate target language across K-10. Let's take a look at the structure of one of the syllabus outcomes and content. Here is an example of what the syllabus content looks like on the digital version. Let's break down the interacting focus area and outcome for stage 4. As you can see, the name of the focus area is on top of the page in the dark blue box, followed by the outcome code and the outcome. So we see here the outcome code is ML4INT01, and the outcome exchanges information and opinions in a range of familiar contexts by using culturally appropriate language. The subheadings on the right-hand side show the content. Now, the first content group shows the communication skills and functions students will learn and demonstrate their learning by. The second content group contains the knowledge necessary of language systems. And finally, the third content group is about applying the knowledge of target language culture. It is important to remember that in order to do one, the communication skills students need too, and in order to do it in a culturally appropriate way, they need 3. In today's statewide staff meeting, we're going to take a look at the interacting focus area. How is interacting different in the new modern languages K-10 syllabus? Interacting requires students to communicate with each other. It is primarily done through oral language. It must be reciprocal. It is spontaneous. In stages 4 and 5, it extends to socializing. I'm not going to go into any further detail at the moment. I will leave it up to our guest speaker. So today we're going to hear from Professor Florencia Henshaw. She's joining us all the way from the US. She has very kindly agreed to present to all our teachers in the middle of the night. So we're very grateful for that. Florencia has a PhD in second language acquisition and teacher education from the University of Illinois, where she's now the Director of Advanced Spanish. She is passionate about helping students develop communicative ability in the target language and about helping teachers make the connections between what they know and what they do. In her YouTube channel and podcast, Unpacking Language Pedagogy, she summarizes and discusses research articles, activities, terms, and various topics related to language teaching. Her co-authored book, Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Theory Goes to the Classroom, aims to help educators visualize how to put principles into action. She's an award-winning educator who has published and presented nationally and internationally on technology integration and research-based pedagogical practices. Thank you, Florencia, and I will pass it on to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Evia, and thank you everybody for being here. For me, it would be odd to have such a large crowd at 11:15 at night, but here we are. So I am new at Teams. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit slow finding messages and things like that, but I think I can keep the chat window open, hopefully, and keep track of any questions and things like that. But if I miss anything, Evia, if you want to interrupt me, I'm okay with that. That is not a problem, because I don't know how fast I'm going to be at checking the chat while presenting.
No problem. If it is a pertinent question, I will interrupt.
Okay, great. Okay, so yes, the topic is certainly very appropriate for what Evia was talking about just now, that we are indeed going to be focusing on interaction, and interaction in the language classroom varies a lot from level to level, and what that interaction looks like, what we can expect. And I only have 45 minutes with you, so my main focus was on this part of scaffolding spontaneity. We will not be able to get them to go out into the world and have great conversations after 1 semester, 1 year, but how do we little by little get them to say more on their own, not depend so much on everything, in their books or their vocab list, and things like that. And interaction to me has always been the most fascinating of all the communication modes. Here in the US, we organize our syllabus and things like that by the 3 communication modes. This is dictated by ACTFL, our own organization. And the 3 modes are very much similar to what you have, just different words for it. Interpretive would be about understanding text, presentational, creating text, and then interpersonal is that interaction piece of it. And based on what we know on how languages develop, especially in an instructed language context, what we see is a little bit of what happens in this famous horse meme, right? That the students tend to do quite well with understanding text for the most part, sometimes listening a little bit less than in writing, depending on the language. And then they tend to do maybe a little better when it comes to creating text, especially if it's writing. But when it comes to the interaction piece, if it is spontaneous interaction, we see that their level appears to be lower than what they can do in terms of understanding. And that is perfectly natural because comprehension always precedes production. And the reason why interaction, oral interaction, it is particularly tricky is because, first of all, it involves both input and output. It's not just one thing. Second, it involves very short reaction times, if you will, right? So cognitive load tends to be higher because we have to process incoming language, and then very quickly we have to retrieve to express meaning. That is very different than if you're just reading a text or if you're just writing something. And last but not least is because it's interpersonal. There's more than one person involved. It is not just us doing everything, but we have to work with at least one other interlocutor, and that adds another factor, right, that sometimes can complicate things. So yeah, interaction is definitely the trickiest of all the things we try to do in the classroom. And yet, when you think about it, it's the one thing that most students want to do when they think about the target language. They want to have a conversation in the target language. So interaction has, for me, two key aspects in particular. The first one is very similar to what Evia was talking about in terms of being reciprocal, in that it has to involve some kind of an exchange, some kind of a back and forth. And for me, that phrase back and forth has been really, really useful when I'm evaluating an activity and I'm trying to determine how well it's going to lead to an actual interaction, because some activities, some topics may seem great on paper, but when you think about, when you picture the students having that conversation, you quickly realize that it turns almost into mini presentations. One person says their part, one person says their part, and then they stare at each other like, okay, now what do we do? So we need to think about whether the activity, the task we're giving them to do, truly lends themselves to back and forth. And it has to be purposeful and meaningful. And by that, I mean not just have a conversation to practice asking questions. There's no clear purpose of what they would do with that information. And then there's almost very little attention paid to meaning, because all they want to do is just practice asking questions, right? So that doesn't quite count as interaction for me. I'm thinking of what we do out in the real world, where one person, is asking questions because they need to determine something or decide something, or, I need somebody to take care of my dogs, and I'm going to ask them questions. When are they available? Can you come by? Things like that. We are exchanging information because I need that information to make a decision, or I need that information for something else. I'm going to be doing something with it. Now, in the classroom, that is going to need a little bit of adaptation. We're not always going to be able to do exactly what we do in the so-called real world. It's going to need a little bit of adaptation, because the students in the classroom are gaining those skills that they will then put to use outside of the classroom in different types of interactions. So we'll get to that, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by not quite exactly that, but it's still purposeful and meaningful. And then the other thing that to me is absolutely a key aspect of interaction is an information gap. And by that, I mean that the other person doesn't know exactly what the interlocutor will say. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to go 100% cold and not knowing anything at all, because it's not like that. Even when we talk to friends, we can almost anticipate what a friend is going to say, right? Like we get to know people, or is an answer that seems perhaps obvious, right? So I'm not talking about it has to be 100% unknown, unpredictable, surprising exchanges at every turn. I'm not talking about that. But what I'm talking about is that I'm not asking questions that I already know the answer to. So if, for example, you give the students a schedule, somebody's, a student's class schedule, and everyone sees the same schedule, and the task is just ask yourselves questions about the student schedule. Why would I ask questions? I have the same schedule in front of me. So even if I ask, what days does this person take math classes? I already know the answer to. So why would I be asking you that question? So even though it looks like there is interaction because one person's asking a question and the other one is answering, there really is no information gap because I already know the answer to it. So those kinds of activities, I would not consider them truly an interaction activity. So interpersonal communication or interaction is complex because it's not just one thing that we need to be aiming for. It's not just speaking, it is not just having multiple interlocutors, and it is not just spontaneous. There are many things that we need to be working on. So if you gave your students a speaking assignment, at least that's very common here in the US, where the students are given a prompt and all they have to do is record a response, that doesn't make the activity interaction. Just because they're talking, that doesn't mean it's interpersonal. Same with just because you have multiple interlocutors, like the example of here's the schedule, ask each other questions, but everybody can see the same schedule. There are multiple interlocutors and they're talking, but that doesn't quite count as actual interaction. And it's not just spontaneous because you may have a spontaneous activity that leads to almost no interaction at all, right? So one person says something, and they kind of go, their separate ways. So it's not just spontaneous. There's many things we need to be working on. So how do we get there, right? So when we look at the qualifications for interaction, what are the elements we need to work on to get there? So the first one is, yes, we need to work on oral output, right? So the expression of meaning orally, right, in talking. And the reason why I clarify this is because different people may have different definitions of what counts as output. To me, if somebody is merely rehearsing something that they have, been memorizing, like a script, or they're just copying something down, or they're just reading something out loud, to me, that doesn't count as output in the sense of expression of meaning. They're not expressing meaning if the activity could be done without paying attention to meaning. The other thing we need to work on as well, which sometimes we forget when we're thinking about interaction, we're always thinking about the output part, right? The talking part. But interaction involves listening, comprehension, understanding what the other person is saying, what the other person is asking. So that is another element that we need to work on to lead to interaction. And fluency, or the speed in which students are retrieving the necessary elements, words, phrases, etc., to express themselves, is yet another element that we need to work on, especially if we're aiming for spontaneous interaction. And last but not least, part of that is one element of communicative competence that sometimes we remember, sometimes we don't remember to work on, and that is strategic competence. So it's not just knowing the language part of it. And it is not just, knowing when to say something, but the strategic competence is what happens when you don't know how to say something. What happens when you don't understand somebody? All of the strategies we use as speakers of the language to overcome certain situations, especially when we're interacting. And so one of them that I think is very, very relevant to most learners, including advanced level learners, is circumlocution, right? So the ability to not be stumped by the lack of knowledge of one particular word or how to say one specific things, but rather to work around that issue and still make yourself understood. Or if your interlocutor doesn't understand you, how do you express yourself? Or if you're not sure that you understood your interlocutor, what clues can you use to try to see if you understood your interlocutor? So one of the adjectives that Evia used to describe interaction was spontaneous. And indeed, I think that's where we want to get to, absolutely. But sometimes spontaneous seems ominous when we're talking about novice level students in their first or sometimes second year of study. And so to me, it's helpful to see it almost as a continuum, right? Where you go from scripted, which means that the student is not or potentially not retrieving at all from their own system. All they're doing is repeating something verbatim, but they're not analyzing it, right? It's not coming from them. And then the other extreme, of course, you have the spontaneous, which to me tends to be associated with relatively speedy retrieval of the language that they need to express themselves. And then we have something in the middle, which I think is very, very important. And this is where a lot of our learners are for a while. And that is scaffolded interaction, right? Where there's partial retrieval. Some of it, they're using what they know, but some of it, they're using some type of help, whether it is in the sense of preparation, whether it is in looking at a quick vocab list, right? There's something there where it's a little bit of this prepared and a little bit of we're getting closer to being somewhat spontaneous, right? But it's not fully spontaneous 100% on their own yet. Now, to me, both scaffolded and fully spontaneous count, right? So there's nothing wrong with scaffolded, not scripted, but scaffolded to support the students to eventually be fully spontaneous in their interactions. And I have an example. This is from chapter 6 of my book, Common Ground. And almost all of the examples, if you look at that chapter, always have a first step or two where the students are preparing for the interaction. And the interaction are things that we know they can potentially handle, even if there is a misunderstanding, even if the other person asks them a question. It's a very straightforward interaction where we know that if they use the little language they have, let's say if this is novice learners, that they can handle it, right? So we want to set them up for success. So in this particular example, we give them time separately. The students that are going to be interacting are doing their own preparation. So student A is making a list of the things that they want to buy. And then student B is preparing the prices of those items that they have in their store. Of course, you can make changes as needed. This is just one particular example, right? But I think it's important to give students separate time to prepare. They're not preparing a script. They're not telling each other, hey, I'm going to tell you that I need to buy these things. Can you tell me? No. They're not doing that, but they're individually preparing and getting ready for the interaction. Then the students interact, which again can be a very straightforward interaction, and it's okay if it's not perfect. It's okay if it's not complete sentences, that all they're doing is, you have this, I need this, right? If it's just straightforward, very short, simple sentences for this particular level, then that's not a problem. As students, you know, progress and their intermediate, advanced, and yes, of course, we're going to push them a lot more, but it needs to be realistic for their level. And then as a follow-up in step 3, the teacher can then ask if someone was able to buy everything in their list, which items they bought or they did not buy, if they had any money left over, how do the prices compare. So there is a way of sort of bringing it all together. It is not just have this interaction so that you can practice talking and then we're going to move on, but actually they did something with the information they exchanged, and then they're being somewhat held accountable in the follow-up to see how many items they bought or they couldn't buy, etc. Right? So we're doing it's meaningful, it is purposeful, and there is back and forth. And they don't know, right? There's that information gap that they don't know exactly what the other person is going to be buying or exactly how much the items are going to cost. Okay, so I've said that in the continuum, right, we have partial retrieval or speedy retrieval or no retrieval. But what do I mean by retrieving? Retrieving from where? That is a key question. And some teachers think that retrieving from memory equals bad. And we have to unpack that a little bit. It's not necessarily that retrieving from memory is bad, because a lot of what we retrieve from, especially novice learners, is memorized stuff, right? And we need to understand where the difference lies. So if they're retrieving these memorized chunks, so for example, in Spanish, something that the students know very well are things like, you know, what is your name, ¿cómo te llamas, cómo se dice, how do you say, right? All of these phrases that they have stored as phrases, and they can say them very accurately because they are these memorized chunks, but they know, the students know what they mean, and they're retrieving them to express a particular meaning. So yes, that is retrieval, and that is okay. Of course, if the student is creating with language, they're, you know, rearranging, expressing meaning, using all of the elements that they have, even if it's a partially established linguistic system with some imprecision, and that is perfectly okay. Of course, right, this would be the easiest one to say, yes, they're retrieving from their system. The difference, the key difference here lies in that they're not merely and exclusively repeating from an external source, whether that is a script that they wrote and memorized, whether that is that they're just reading from a vocab list, whether it is that they're just repeating the prompt, right? All of those things would not be considered that they're retrieving, right, from their system, even if their system is partially contains memorized things. They're not retrieving from that, they're merely repeating. And that's where we make the difference between their interacting versus, I'm not sure what I would call the other one, maybe acting, right? That they're just doing a script as opposed to actually interacting with each other, expressing meaning and interpreting meaning back and forth. So if we think about those things and we look at this particular activity, right, one student gets that piece of paper with one text that has some blanks. Another student gets a different text that has different blanks. And so would we say that this counts as interaction or not? I don't know if I'm going to be able to see the chat. Can I see the chat while presenting? Maybe not. Okay, I don't think I'm able to see the chat while presenting. I'm sorry, at least I can't figure out how to do that. So in this particular case, what we see is that one student, all they have to do is read that particular word, and the other student has to write it down. But they could do that even if they didn't understand what that word was. Right, so all I need to do is maybe know how to pronounce it, maybe. I could mispronounce it and simply spell it out, and the other person writes it down. So even if neither of us have any idea what árboles means, I could spell it out for you and you can complete it, and then we would be accomplishing this particular task. But there will be no meaning exchanged. And so in this case, some people think, oh, but there's a gap. Well, yes, but it's not a meaningful gap because I don't need to understand it and you don't need to understand me. And so something like this would not be interaction. They're not retrieving from their system, and there's absolutely no meaning necessarily involved. Could the students understand it? Of course, I mean, they can understand all kinds of things, but there's no way to verify that they're understanding the way that the activity is, at least. And it could be done without understanding. That is the difference. It's not like, are they understanding, but could it be done without paying attention to meaning? So if the answer is yes, it could be done without paying attention to meaning, then we know it's not a meaningful exchange. If we compare it with this particular activity, we see that now student A, student B, they have different maps. So student A has the weather in the southern part of the country, student B has the weather in the northern part of the country, and they need to help each other out to complete it. So student A needs to express meaning, even if it's very simple, right? This is, you know, probably novice students, right? They're not going to be able to give you a full weather forecast. But even if it's just very simple, they need to express meaning on their own. They need to be retrieving from what they know, using the language they know to be able to help their partner. And so in this case, there is meaning involved, because if you don't know how to say something, you're not going to be able to communicate it. If I'm not understanding you, I'm not going to be able to complete the map. So in this case, we see the difference with the activity before with the blanks in the text. So one thing I keep bringing back over and over again is, you know, well, but the students might be novice learners, right? It might be just their first year of study. And yes, proficiency and interaction are very, very tightly linked. And in all, of course, all communication modes, right? What can they do is dependent on their proficiency. But it's almost like we see it so clearly when the students are interacting, how much their proficiency level affects, you know, the extent of the interaction. And one aspect of novice learners is that they are primarily reactive. If you think about, I mean, I don't know if you are learning a new language yourself, or if you've ever been in a country where they speak a different language and you may know just a few phrases to survive. What do? You are primarily reactive. That means that you are depending on your interlocutors or on external sources to help you carry any type of interaction, right? If you don't know a language very well, you know just a few phrases, and you go to a restaurant, you're probably going to depend a lot on what the person's saying and maybe repeating what they're saying. Sometimes you may rely on the menu, right? Like there's just, because we cannot be initiating a lot of the interaction when we are novice level learners. The farther away we get from novice, the less we rely on the interlocutor and the more we initiate interaction spontaneously. But to expect novice learners to be initiating interaction spontaneously almost always leads to frustration. It leads to frustration not just on the part of the student, but on the part of the instructor, right? You feel like they still can't say much. So I see they need, they need a script, or they need, you feel the need to be providing them with everything. And sort of we need to adjust our expectations of what a novice learner can do, because there is some level of interaction that they can have. It's just not going to be extensive. It's not going to be complete sentences. Like, we just need to adjust our expectations of what type of interaction a novice learner can have. And especially when we're talking about learner-learner interaction, now we are sort of removing that help of a more proficient interlocutor that you would have, right? So if a novice learner is interacting with you, the instructor, then you are a big part of the conversation and you can provide a lot of that scaffolding. But what happens when two learners interact with each other? We are removing that, and that's where a lot of concerns come in. One of them, which is a very valid concern, is that the students won't stay on task or that they won't use the target language to accomplish that task. And the example with the weather map, a concern might be that the students might just simply tell each other in the language they share and they feel most comfortable in what the weather is, and then call it a day. And I completely understand this this concern, because it happens even in my classroom, right? I think the question is, are they motivated to do so? So the best answer I can give you is that if the students don't see a real purpose for why are we having these kinds of interactions, if, let's say, they're never assessed on it, or they just do not see them being helpful for any other part of the course, right? If they see it almost as something isolated and they're not particularly motivated to learn the language, then they're not going to be motivated to do the task or to use the target language. But if they see them as key opportunities to gain skills for something else that, you know, something they're going to be assessed on later on, sometimes then the learners get a little bit more motivated to try to use the target language. And of course, the big question we need to ask ourselves is, are they able to do so? If we are expecting them to do a weather map when they have never seen any weather expressions, or they only saw them one time a week ago, they're going to get frustrated, right? And that's where it's easier to use the dominant language. But so if we have provided enough scaffolding that they won't get so frustrated to switch to English, in our case, or their dominant language, then we are increasing the odds that this will happen, or at least minimizing this concern. The other concern is the issue of students not the interaction not being reciprocal, as Evia said, right? That they don't negotiate anything; they just take turns talking. One person talks, the other one talks, right? It feels like they're not even listening to each other. This sometimes is a task effect. The activity we're asking them to do is not really conducive to negotiation. It's not really conducive to them paying attention to what the other person is saying, because it's being sometimes portrayed as more like practice talking as opposed to interact with each other. And then, of course, are the expectations realistic? Even in the one with a weather map, even in the one with you need to buy items, they're not going to be, you know, doing a lot of follow-up questions, and that's okay, because we are expecting very straightforward interaction, and that is the level of interaction that the learners are expected to have. If we are expecting novice learners to come up with all these spontaneous follow-up questions, we're more likely to be disappointed than not. Like I said before, novice is mostly reactive as opposed to initiating spontaneous interaction. So when it comes to peer interaction in class, I think once again, it has to be purposeful, meaning that the students should be accountable for paying attention to each other. And you as the teacher need to have a way to know that they exchanged specific information. And then it has to be guided, especially novice learners, even intermediate. It has to be somewhat guided as opposed to just a prompt. But we have to be very, very careful not to cross the line over to almost unnatural, where you're giving the students so many restrictions that the interaction becomes a checklist of things they have to do, as opposed to truly expressing and interpreting meaning. So when we're putting so many restrictions, like only speak in complete sentences, use at least 2 irregular verbs, make sure you use this vocabulary, etc., we turn the focus to the language itself, as opposed to the communication, as opposed to were they able to exchange the information to accomplish whatever purpose, whatever task you wanted them to accomplish. And the question is, of course, how much are we guiding them, right? Because especially novice learners, we want to guide them so they don't get frustrated, but at the same time, we don't want to guide them too much that it becomes entirely scripted. So some things to keep in mind is, of course, this is something that Evia also said, right? They need to have a lot of input that is recent and relevant, that you have recycled it, that you have activated it recently enough that it is available for retrieval for the output part. And again, not just reading. I know that it may seem like they sound great because they're saying so much and they're saying it correctly and it's beautiful, but then it's not interaction, right? If they're just reading to each other, if it's a dictation exercise, that is not interpersonal communication. And then, of course, we want to increase spontaneity gradually, so they're not used to always the same scaffolding forever and ever, that they get too used to only saying this much, right? Little by little, we need to get them comfortable with the uncomfortable part of speaking a language, which is having to retrieve from your own system without a whole lot of outside help, right? And then how do you get there? So what we need to do is to avoid going from, to use the bike analogy, right? So to go from using training wheels because they're learning how to ride a bike to all of a sudden they have to do the Tour de France, right? It is way too much and it's just going to lead to frustration and not wanting to do it. So how do we get them there? So let's use an example. Let's unpack this particular activity, right? So in this case, the prompt just says work in pairs, ask each other questions about family traditions and celebrations. Be sure to ask follow-up questions on the information your partner is sharing. For example, what do you eat that day? Now, it may seem like we have the best intentions in the world for them to exchange meaning, and then we may have the best intentions in the world by reminding them to ask follow-up questions. But again, is it realistic for the level of the students? And then the bigger question for me on something like this is, what is the purpose, right? How are you going to make sure that the students listened to each other, that they paid attention to each other, that there is back and forth, right? If we're talking about, relative novice, maybe intermediate low students, the follow-up questions are going to be very, very few, if any. And sometimes the risk with this that we need to anticipate is that the student may be able to ask the question, but their partner may not be able to answer it. Novice learners, for example, my novice learners, they can say why, por qué, right? It's easy, short, little phrase. They ask a question, but the partner doesn't have the language to answer why. And so we need to make sure that we anticipate what the conversation is going to be like, and that everyone, both interlocutors, are going to be successful at the interaction. So what can we do instead? Instead of just the prompt and ask each other questions, good luck to you, go, which is too much for novice learners, we want to scaffold it. So the first thing what we need to do is to make sure that the goal is clear for the students. What are we trying to find out? So a goal for this particular activity could be something like to determine similarities and differences between the way we celebrate our favorite holidays. So we start with a goal and we're going to come back to this goal after the interaction. Before interacting, we want to do some linguistic brainstorm, activating or reactivating that input that we may have given them a long time ago or recently, but still make sure that it's right there, ready for retrieval, and it serves as support, right? So maybe you have them brainstorm some phrases or words that could be useful for describing what they do in their favorite holiday. So maybe things like food, drinks, activities. This could be in the form of a graphic organizer. Then you're going to give them some time to write yes, no questions. And they write them individually. You help them, of course, if somebody needs help. But this is not about let's coordinate what we're going to ask each other. Every student writes their own questions. Then they need to interact and take notes. The notes can be taken, for example, in the form of Venn diagrams. Our purpose was to find similarities and differences. So if they ask things like, do you eat turkey? Do you give each other presents, right? Like if they ask these yes, no questions, then maybe they can take quick notes in different parts of the Venn diagram as a similarity or difference, and could be one way. Just one idea doesn't mean they have to, right? But give them something to take notes, because we can't, I mean, I even am having a conversation right now in English, and I'm pretty advanced in English. I don't think I can remember everything that my partner said. So it's always good to reduce that load on the memory. And okay, you can have notes, so you don't have to be remembering everything your partner's saying. So you can keep focusing on expressing meaning and on understanding what your partner is saying. And then after the interaction, we want to come back to our goal. We're going to give them a little bit of time to summarize the similarities and differences. If needed, you can give them some sentence starters or some examples of what that summary looks like. Depends on their level, right? If they can do it on their own, then they do it on their own. And then share what you found, right? And then you as the teacher, you notice some patterns among the responses of what learners are sharing that they found out interacting with only one other student. And maybe your reaction was, wait a minute, they wrote the questions and asked each other these questions, so isn't that scripted? The reason why they wrote the question is because they're novice learners. They're not quite ready to be fully spontaneous with their questions. They need some time to think about the questions that they're going to ask. And there is still a gap in the sense that they prepare their questions individually. They do not know what the other person will ask or say. That is the difference between repeating. Everybody's repeating a script and they're not really exchanging meaning. There is still a purposeful exchange of information, and you may even have negotiation of meaning because they didn't know what the person was going to ask or say. So if one person asked, do you eat turkey? And I don't know what turkey is, I will ask my partner, what is turkey? So there's still a possibility of negotiation of meaning. You don't see negotiation of meaning when it is fully scripted, because you know exactly what the other person is going to say. I don't have a need to be asking you, or there's no misunderstandings are going to arise because I say my lines, you say your lines, right? A similar example we have in chapter 1 of Common Ground, where we give the students some sentence starters, some room for adding predictions. So the way this particular activity is framed is with prediction and confirmation. So they're going to be doing some predictions about what they think is probably true for their classmate. Then they're going to interview their classmate to make sure to confirm or refute their predictions. And then obviously the follow-up is for the students to tell us, you know, how well they know their classmate or how predictable their classmate is. So we're giving them some language in step 1, but as you can see, there's room for that one learner to come up with something that then I need to be paying attention to. There's still an information gap. It is scaffolded. It's not going to be 100% unpredictable, and we know that we're talking about routines, right? So they have to have something in common that again, it doesn't have to be 100% unknown what the other person is going to talk about, but there are those little gaps that I need to be paying attention for me to tell you whether I do wake up at, maybe you predicted 7, but I wake up at 5, right? In that sense, there could still be some negotiation of meaning, especially the last two where they write their own predictions, right? And then it is completely new what the classmate is going to ask them. And yes, in step 2, they write the questions down. This, we're thinking about novice learners, and they're still needing help with that. But of course, with time, we're going to be taking those training wheels away. So how do we take those training wheels away? Well, maybe yes, at the beginning, they write the questions down and use them in that activity. Very good. A little bit later on, for another activity, now write the questions down, but put them away while interacting. So we gave the brain some preparation time, and there might be retrieving from short-term memory, some of them. That's okay. But they cannot possibly have memorized. We didn't tell them to memorize the questions. We told them to write the questions down, and then you're going to tell them, okay, now we're going to talk, but first put the questions away. And then the third one would be give them time to think about what you can ask, but don't write anything. So we're giving the brain some time to think about and prepare, but they're not going to have things written down. So little by little, we can be taking those training wheels away. Something that is very popular here in the US is to use word walls or chat mats. These are posters or sometimes, handouts where the students have useful phrases, useful words, sometimes with icons and sometimes with translations. And again, to me, this is one more form of a training wheel, right? So it's fine as a training wheel to support the completion of an interpersonal task, but we always have to come back to how much can they do on their own at some point. If the student is over-reliant on that word wall, that vocab list, that chat mat, to carry out the interpersonal task, then they cannot do a whole lot on their own, and so their interaction level is going to be very, very low. We need to make sure that we, earlier on as we're preparing for the interaction, that's not a problem, but then make sure that at some point the students are held accountable for interacting without all of the support. And sometimes these vocab lists or word walls are there to help the student not feel frustrated that they can't remember a particular word. And I understand that, and yes, of course, we need vocabulary, right? We need to build that vocabulary and that retrieval, absolutely. It's also important for the students not to think that they always need the exact perfect word. I think that we need to help them work on circumlocution as a skill that builds spontaneity later on. One possible activity that you can do to work on circumlocution is a two-way crossword puzzle. So that is when one student has half of the words, the other student has the other half, and they need to help each other out to complete that puzzle by defining or describing the words. It doesn't have to be a perfect, beautiful definition, but at least to give their partners enough hints. Could be an example, could be brands, could be whatever they need to use to make themselves understood. And so these are good activities to be working on circumlocution while recycling, refreshing their memory on specific words. More ideas for preparation other than, the writing, the questions, other than working on circumlocution. So one thing you can do is not exactly interaction, but it's preparation for interaction, would be listen and write. So they're listening to the question, but then they're writing their response. And so with this, we're working on that listening comprehension portion of interaction, and we're working on expression of meaning and retrieving from their system. But they're giving a little bit more time. When you're writing, you have more time to think about, to edit yourself, etc. And it is indeed fantastic. I know that we're thinking that interaction has to be oral, but in the brain there isn't a complete separation between oral and written. A lot of the things that we do in writing help us to have really good interactions later on. So use that, use the written word if it is easier for your students as preparation for interaction. This does not mean that you listen, you write your answer, and then you pretend to have a conversation using it as a script. It's not. This is an idea for preparing the learners to work on that retrieval and to work on listening comprehension. But eventually we want them later on to listen to that question and be able to answer orally using the language they have, right? So I'm not saying this is a substitution for it, but how do we prepare, how do we work on specific skills? More ideas for preparation could be interpersonal simulations where they are listening to the question and they are recording their answer. So we're working on expression of meaning in oral output, but we're removing that pressure of that real time with another human being, right? So we are just making it a little bit more one way, but we are isolating those skills that we need to work on, right? The listening to a question once and understanding it, and being able to record their answers and like expressing themselves orally to the best of their ability. And depending on how you set it up, you could push for fluency in the sense that they have to answer on the spot, or you could give them some time to collect their thoughts and think about what they're going to say. But again, not write everything down, not ask Google Translate for help, but try to the best of your abilities, to answer the question. Another idea for preparation, especially when it comes to helping the students be more fluent, meaning retrieving faster, is to work on activities that involve task repetition. So if you ask them a question and you tell them to answer, maybe orally or in writing, and then put that away, okay, answer again. The same question again. And now you reduce the time. So maybe you gave them 4 minutes first, now you have 3 minutes, now you have 2 minutes. And with each repetition of that task that they have to answer that question again, and they have to answer that question again, the answers get better. They start refining their answer and they start retrieving faster because we already activated a lot of what they will need, right? And it may seem like, well, but this is too repetitive. Yes, it's task repetition. But remember that, for language learning, the brain loves repetition, right? The brain loves frequency. It cannot just be you saw a word one time, you're using it one time, okay, you're done. I wish it were that simple, right? So you need a lot of this, the seeing the same word over and over again and the using the same word over and over again. So whenever you can include task repetition, that you're asking the same question, maybe not the same day if your learners are going to get bored, but then every day they have to answer the same question, or every other day, right? You bring up questions they already answered, right? So just to get those connections active, right? So that they are retrieving faster and faster. And the last thing I'll mention in terms of preparation that I think is absolutely crucial is whole class interaction, you interacting with the class. I think it is absolutely essential before expecting paired interaction. We cannot be asking the students to interact on their own if they've never seen similar types of interaction with everyone, especially with you involved, to serve as a model of what that interaction looks like. So in whole class interaction, the key thing is that the teacher is one of the interlocutors. So there is a lot of provision of wonderful input. You control the negotiation of form because you're going to be the one doing the follow-up questions, and I didn't understand this, and the pushing for things and giving feedback, right? So it is absolutely wonderful to have one interlocutor who is more proficient than the learners. And so that is what we achieve with whole class interaction. Plus, the fact that you are sort of interacting with everyone is different than a one-on-one interaction from an effective perspective. So one possibility would be that the students interview you. So you become one of the interlocutors. They're the ones asking the question, you're the one providing the answers. So you're giving them lots of that great input that you hope at some point they will be able to produce, right? So for example, you ask the students, help me choose something, help me choose a trip, help me choose a pet to adopt, help me choose a house to rent or buy, help me choose a restaurant to go to. And then the students have to interview you to get information to make that particular recommendation. And then, yes, you can help them out as needed, right? This doesn't have to be like an exam. But, you know, the students will ask you questions. If you don't understand, you help them out. Do you mean this, right? And you give them the question. So there's different ways that you can provide help as you are interacting, or scaffold as you are interacting. And then they use that information to give their recommendations. Usually I like to have like plan A and plan B, and it tells me a little bit more about how much they understood, right? So how much I want them to be paying attention to what I'm saying and then using that information for something. And then another way, perhaps a little bit simpler, is to do whole class infogap tasks. So infogap tasks tend to be a little bit more structured than just help me decide something, in the sense that we are doing one specific task, like follow directions, spot the differences, recreate a picture, right? Where one person student A, the other person student B. The weather map that we saw earlier, that would be an example of a paired infogap. But now we're doing it with you being involved, with the teacher being involved. So the teacher student A and the whole class is student B. And then depending on how much your learners already participate or not, if they are, you know, very good at volunteering, then you can let them volunteer and call people out as needed. If not, what you can do is you call on students just to make sure that everyone is following, right? That everyone is paying attention. And so if you're doing something like following directions on a map or recreating or drawing a picture, you call on students to give you the next direction. Call somebody else. Now, where do I go next? Why do I do this, right? So the students are sort of, they need to be paying attention to who is going to be asked next to keep going, right? So to wrap it up, if we look at this activity in particular, we see some things that are going to need some tweaking based on everything that we talked about, right? So the first thing that you might notice is that even if you don't speak Spanish, you could do this activity. Why? Because we're giving the students everything. We're giving the, how do you say, do you like? We're giving them, how do you answer? We're giving them the names for the fruit, right? We're giving them all of the language that they will need. And so this becomes not retrieving from their own system or memory in any way, because all they're doing is reading the part that matches the translation and then reading the part that matches the picture. So that the first thing that we need to change is that we cannot be giving them everything. Remember, we give them what is the purpose, what are we trying to do, and then provide some scaffolding, not everything they'll need, some scaffolding to get them to, okay, how are you going to accomplish this? And then, of course, what is missing is a purpose, right? Why are they asking each other if they like these fruits? Based on this, we don't know, right? There's got to be something there, a goal stated at the beginning, and then we're going to come back to it at the end and see if that was actually true. So you could do it as the prediction type activity, like the example that I showed earlier, and then you frame it that way, right? You have something at the beginning and then something at the end where you're coming back to it and then verifying your predictions. So thank you all very much for being here. I can't see, I think I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen so that I can see everyone. Okay.
Thank you so much, Florencia. This was great. This is exactly what we've been talking about as well, what we've been sharing with our teachers. It's been very helpful. There haven't been any questions on the chat, but anyone would like to ask?
I went over time. I apologize. I went a little bit over time.
No problem. Thank you. I will actually stop recording now.